The happiest day of my life began with a warning I should have taken seriously. Those words still echo in my mind whenever I think about my wedding day. At 7 o'clock that morning, I stood in front of a large mirror inside a beautiful bridal suite overlooking the rolling hills of a vineyard outside Nashville, Tennessee. Sunlight poured through the tall windows. Everything looked perfect. My dress hung nearby. Fresh flowers filled the room with a soft scent. My bridesmaids laughed as they helped each other get ready. It was the kind of morning every bride dreams about. I remember staring at my reflection and thinking that after 3 years together, Daniel and I were finally about to begin the life we had planned. Every challenge had led us here. Every sacrifice felt worth it. Then my phone buzzed. The message came from my future mother-in-law, Margaret Carter. At first, I smiled. I assumed she was sending a sweet note before the ceremony. Instead, the message contained only one sentence. "There are things about this marriage you still do not understand." I read it twice. Then a third time. My stomach tightened immediately. The words felt strange. Cold. Completely out of place on a wedding morning. I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. Before I could decide, another message appeared. "We need to talk before the ceremony." A nervous feeling settled into my chest. Margaret and I had never been especially close, but we had always been polite with each other. During the wedding planning process, there had been disagreements. She preferred tradition. I preferred simplicity. She wanted a larger guest list. I wanted a smaller ceremony. Nothing unusual. Every family experiences disagreements during weddings. At least that was what I kept telling myself. I slipped the phone into my purse and tried to focus on getting ready. Yet the message continued to bother me. Around 30 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. One of my bridesmaids opened it. Margaret stepped inside. The room immediately became quieter. She wore an elegant navy dress and carried herself with the confidence she always seemed to possess. At 71 years old, she still had the ability to command attention without raising her voice. She smiled at everyone, complimented the flowers, told me I looked beautiful. For a moment, I wondered if I had overreacted to the text messages. Then she asked if we could speak privately. We stepped onto a small balcony overlooking the vineyard. Guests were beginning to arrive below. Everything looked peaceful. Margaret folded her hands together and studied me carefully. "Emily," she said, "are you absolutely certain about today?" The question caught me completely off guard. I laughed nervously. "Of course I am." She did not laugh back. "I am serious." A chill ran through me despite the warm weather. "Why would you ask that?" Margaret looked away toward the parking lot where cars continued arriving. "Because marriage changes everything." I waited for her to continue. Instead, she remained silent. "Finally," I said, "is there something you want to tell me?" Her expression softened for just a moment. Then it disappeared. "I just think people should understand exactly what they are walking into." Before I could ask another question, she glanced at her watch. "We should get back inside." And just like that, the conversation ended. She walked away, leaving me alone on the balcony with more questions than answers. The rest of the morning felt different after that. Every time I saw Margaret, I noticed something unusual. She seemed to be everywhere, talking quietly with vendors, speaking with relatives, pulling Daniel aside for private conversations. Whenever I approached, the discussion stopped. Each time, Margaret smiled politely as though nothing was wrong. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe wedding stress was affecting my judgment. Yet the uneasy feeling continued growing. By noon, guests filled the vineyard. Music drifted through the air. The ceremony was less than 2 hours away. I should have been excited. Instead, I found myself watching my future mother-in-law more than I watched anyone else. Then something happened that made my heart drop. As I walked through the reception hall during a final inspection, I noticed Margaret standing beside the wedding coordinator. They were reviewing paperwork together. The coordinator looked confused. Margaret looked determined. Before I could reach them, the coordinator nodded and made a note on her clipboard. Margaret turned and saw me approaching. For a brief moment, surprise flashed across her face. Then she smiled again, the same calm smile she had worn all morning. "Everything is under control," she said. I wanted to believe her. Looking back now, that was the exact moment I should have realized my wedding day was about to change forever. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking everything. Weddings are stressful. People act differently under pressure. Families become emotional. That was the explanation I repeated in my head as I returned to the bridal suite. Yet the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. The image of Margaret standing beside the wedding coordinator stayed with me. She had looked far too comfortable making changes to an event that Daniel and I had spent nearly a year planning. By 1 o'clock, the vineyard was buzzing with activity. Guests filled the outdoor seating area. Photographers moved from group to group, capturing family pictures. Music floated through the warm Tennessee air. From a distance, everything looked exactly as it should. Up close, however, small things started feeling wrong. The first sign appeared when my maid of honor, Rachel, walked into the bridal suite, holding a confused expression. "Emily, did you approve a seating chart change?" she asked. I immediately looked up. "What seating chart change?" Rachel frowned. "A few tables were rearranged during setup." My stomach tightened. "Who changed them?" She hesitated. "The coordinator said a family member requested it." I already knew the answer before she said the next words. "Margaret." I closed my eyes for a second. It seemed like such a minor thing. A few tables. A simple adjustment. Yet something about it bothered me. Daniel and I had spent weeks carefully organizing where everyone would sit. Every decision had been intentional. Why would Margaret change it without asking? Trying to stay calm, I found the coordinator near the reception tent. "Can you explain what happened with the seating?" I asked. The young woman immediately looked uncomfortable. I thought the change had already been approved. Approved by who? Her eyes shifted nervously. Mrs. Carter said there had been a misunderstanding and she was helping correct it. I forced a smile. "I see." The coordinator apologized several times. It was obvious she believed she was helping. I thanked her and walked away before frustration could become visible. A few minutes later, I found Daniel near the vineyard entrance greeting relatives. "Did your mother move tables around?" I asked quietly. Daniel looked surprised. "I have no idea. She apparently changed the seating chart." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom probably thought she was helping." The answer irritated me more than I expected. "Helping who?" Daniel opened his mouth, but never answered. Instead, he glanced toward the parking lot. "Can we not do this right now?" That response hurt. Not because he was defending Margaret, because he was dismissing my concern on a day when I needed support. I nodded and walked away before the conversation could turn into an argument. Back inside the venue, I focused on getting dressed. The ceremony was approaching quickly. I refused to let anything ruin the day. Then another problem appeared. Rachel entered the room carrying a small decorative box that should have contained handwritten letters Daniel and I planned to exchange before the ceremony. Her face was pale. "Emily, I cannot find Daniel's letter." For a moment, I thought she was joking. "What?" She opened the box. My letter to Daniel was still inside. His letter to me was gone. We searched everywhere. The dressing room, the preparation area, the photography suite. Nothing. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Finally, one of the venue staff members approached carrying a folded envelope. "Someone asked me to give you this," she said. Relief flooded through me. I immediately recognized Daniel's handwriting. Yet as I opened the envelope, something felt strange. The seal had already been broken. My pulse quickened. Someone had opened it before it reached me. Rachel noticed immediately. Was it like that? I shook my head slowly. Neither of us spoke. Then I looked toward the reception area below. Across the property, I spotted Margaret speaking with several relatives. She laughed at something someone said. Calm, relaxed, completely unbothered. I had no proof she was involved. None at all. Yet for the first time that day, a frightening possibility entered my mind. What if the strange messages, the seating chart changes, the private conversations, and now this missing letter were not separate incidents? What if they were connected? The ceremony was now less than an hour away. Guests were taking their seats. The musicians were preparing. Everything should have felt magical. Instead, as I stared across the vineyard toward my future mother-in-law, I felt something I never expected to feel on my wedding day. I felt like I was waiting for the next thing to go wrong. By the time the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I felt emotionally exhausted. That alone should have been impossible. Every bridal magazine I had ever read described the hour before a wedding as magical, exciting, emotional in the best possible way. Instead, I felt tense, alert, as though I were waiting for something I could not yet see. Rachel helped straighten my veil while the photographer prepared for the final pre-ceremony pictures. Everyone around me seemed determined to keep the mood light. I appreciated the effort, but my mind kept returning to Margaret, the strange text messages, the seating chart changes, Daniel's open letter. None of it made sense. Yet all of it felt connected. Then another surprise arrived. The wedding coordinator entered the room carrying a clipboard. "Emily, before we start, I need clarification on something." My heart immediately sank. "What now?" The coordinator looked genuinely confused. "There are two versions of the ceremony program." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" She handed me both copies. At first glance, they looked identical. Then I noticed a difference. My carefully written welcome message had been removed from one version. In its place was a completely different introduction, one I had never seen before. My eyes moved quickly across the page. The message focused almost entirely on family legacy, tradition, and the Carter family history. It even included a paragraph praising Margaret and her late husband for creating the family Daniel came from. I felt my face grow warm. "Who approved this?" The coordinator hesitated. "Mrs. Carter provided it this morning." Rachel looked horrified. "You are kidding." The coordinator immediately realized something was wrong. I thought everyone knew. I closed my eyes briefly. Every change by itself sounded small. Together, however, they created a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone was rewriting pieces of my wedding day, and every road seemed to lead back to Margaret. Before I could process the latest discovery, another staff member appeared. 5 minutes until processional. The room suddenly exploded with movement. Bridesmaids gathered bouquets. Photographers adjusted equipment. Everyone rushed into position. There was no longer time to investigate anything. The ceremony was happening whether I was ready or not. A few moments later, I stood beside my father at the entrance to the outdoor ceremony space. Soft music drifted through the vineyard. Rows of guests filled white chairs beneath a canopy of flowers. The setting looked breathtaking. For the first time all day, I felt a brief sense of calm. Then I spotted Margaret sitting in the front row. She looked completely composed, confident, almost satisfied. The expression unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The music changed. The signal had been given. It was time. My father squeezed my hand gently. "You ready?" I forced a smile. "Yes." Together we began walking down the aisle. As hundreds of eyes turned toward me, everything else disappeared for a moment. The vineyard, the guests, the tension. All I could see was Daniel waiting beneath the floral arch. He looked emotional, happy, nervous. The sight immediately reminded me why I was there. We reached the front. My father kissed my cheek and took his seat. Daniel reached for my hands. "You look incredible," he whispered. I smiled genuinely for the first time that day. Then the officiant began speaking. The ceremony moved smoothly at first. Guests smiled. A few relatives wiped away tears. Everything seemed to be recovering. Then the officiant reached the section where family members were invited to share short blessings. This had been carefully planned. Daniel's sister was scheduled to speak for 2 minutes. Nobody else. Yet before she could stand, another voice interrupted. "Actually, there is something I would like to say." My blood turned cold. Margaret was already on her feet. Confused murmurs spread through the audience. I looked toward Daniel. His expression mirrored my own shock. This was not part of the program. The officiant looked uncertain. Margaret smiled politely and stepped forward. "It will only take a moment." Every instinct inside me screamed that something was wrong. The guests remained silent. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me. Margaret accepted the microphone. Then she turned toward the audience and began speaking. What happened next would become the moment everyone remembered from our wedding day. Not the vows, not the flowers, not the celebration. Just Margaret standing in front of every person we loved and saying the one thing she should never have said. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The vineyard seemed to fall completely silent as Margaret stood holding the microphone. Guests exchanged confused glances. The officiant stepped back uncertainly. Daniel stared at his mother as though he was trying to understand what was happening. I stood frozen beside him, my bouquet suddenly feeling heavier than it had moments earlier. Margaret smiled warmly at the audience. If someone had arrived at that exact moment, they would have assumed everything was perfectly normal. "I apologize for interrupting," she began. "But before this ceremony continues, there are a few things I would like to share." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. Several people assumed she was delivering a heartfelt family tribute. I wanted to believe that too. Then she turned toward Daniel. "My son has always had an extraordinary heart." Her voice remained calm and steady. Even as a child, he worried more about other people than he did about himself. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I could tell he was already uneasy. Margaret continued. "His father used to say that Daniel would spend his entire life trying to make everyone around him happy. Some guests smiled. Others nodded. Nothing seemed inappropriate yet. Then Margaret's attention moved toward me. That quality is one of the reasons I have worried about him. The knot in my stomach tightened instantly. Daniel looked at her. Mom. She ignored him. Marriage is a serious commitment. It is not something that should be entered into lightly. The atmosphere changed immediately. Guests stopped smiling. My maid of honor looked horrified from her seat near the front row. The officiant glanced between all of us, clearly debating whether to intervene. Margaret continued speaking as though she had rehearsed every word. I know everyone here believes today is a celebration. Her eyes briefly met mine. But I also believe honesty matters. My pulse thundered in my ears. Daniel stepped forward. Mom, please stop. Again, she ignored him. There are times when love can make people overlook important realities. The audience had become completely silent. I could see relatives staring at one another in confusion. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked fascinated. Every wedding has moments guests remember. I knew with growing certainty that this was becoming one of those moments. Margaret, I said carefully, this is not the time. She looked directly at me. For the first time all day, her smile disappeared. That is exactly why it is the time. The words landed like a punch. Audible whispers spread through the audience. Daniel moved closer to his mother. Enough. Margaret finally looked at him. For a brief moment, I thought she might stop. Instead, she took a slow breath and delivered the statement that shattered whatever normalcy remained. I do not believe either of you truly understands what you are getting into. Gasps echoed across the seating area. Someone in the back actually dropped a program. I felt heat rush to my face. Humiliation flooded through me. This was not a private conversation. This was not family advice offered behind closed doors. This was happening in front of nearly 200 guests. Friends, relatives, co-workers, people who had traveled across multiple states to celebrate with us. Daniel looked devastated. Mom, what are you doing? For the first time, Margaret appeared emotional. Not angry, not hostile, emotional. Her voice trembled slightly, trying to prevent a mistake. The answer stunned everyone, including me. Daniel shook his head in disbelief. A mistake. Margaret swallowed hard. You are rushing into something neither of you fully understands. The words echoed through the vineyard. I could barely process what I was hearing. After years together, after months of planning, after every conversation and every commitment, Daniel's mother had chosen our wedding ceremony to question our marriage. The embarrassment was overwhelming. Yet beneath it, another emotion emerged. Confusion. Because Margaret did not look victorious. She looked frightened, deeply frightened, as though she genuinely believed she was helping. The realization only made the situation more disturbing. Daniel reached for the microphone. Give me that. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Margaret slowly handed it over. Tears had appeared in her eyes. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Daniel turned toward the guests. I am sorry. His voice cracked slightly. I honestly do not know what is happening right now. Nobody laughed. Nobody reacted. The entire vineyard seemed suspended in disbelief. Then, from somewhere near the third row, an older woman stood up unexpectedly. I recognized her immediately. It was Margaret's older sister, Eleanor. She had flown in from Arizona for the wedding. Her expression was unlike anything I had ever seen before. She looked alarmed, deeply alarmed. And when she spoke, her words changed everything. Margaret, she said firmly, you promised you would not do this again. The moment those words left her mouth, every person in attendance turned toward her, including Margaret. And the look on my future mother-in-law's face told me there was a story nobody else knew. The entire vineyard seemed frozen after Eleanor spoke. A few moments earlier, every guest had been focused on Margaret. Now all attention shifted toward her older sister. The expression on Margaret's face changed immediately. Shock. Embarrassment. Something deeper that I could not yet identify. Eleanor remained standing. She was nearly 75 years old, but there was a strength in her voice that commanded attention. Margaret, she repeated, more gently this time. You promised. Nobody knew what she meant. At least nobody except the two sisters. Daniel looked from his mother to his aunt. I could see confusion written all over his face. Aunt Eleanor, he said cautiously, what are you talking about? Eleanor hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like she was debating whether to continue. Then she looked directly at me. The sympathy in her eyes made my stomach sink. Emily deserves the truth, she said quietly. Margaret immediately shook her head. Not here. It was the first time all afternoon that she sounded frightened. Eleanor sighed. This became public the moment you stood up with that microphone. Silence followed. No one argued. No one interrupted. Even the musicians sat quietly watching. Daniel stepped closer to his aunt. Please tell me what is happening. Eleanor looked at him for several seconds. Your mother has done something like this before. A wave of murmurs spread through the guests. I felt my heart pounding again. What do you mean? Daniel asked. Eleanor's eyes filled with sadness. 28 years ago, she almost stopped another wedding. The words landed heavily across the audience. Margaret closed her eyes. Daniel looked stunned. What wedding? Eleanor swallowed hard. Mine. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The revelation seemed impossible. Eleanor continued before anyone could interrupt. The week before my wedding, your mother became convinced I was making a mistake. Her voice remained calm. She called repeatedly, sent letters, tried to convince me to postpone everything. Margaret stared at the ground. Eleanor shook her head sadly. She believed she was protecting me. I felt a chill run through my body. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The warnings, the doubts, the certainty that she alone understood something everyone else had missed. Daniel looked back toward his mother. Mom. Margaret finally raised her head. Tears streamed down her face now. It was different. Eleanor smiled sadly. You always say that. The exchange felt less like an argument and more like a conversation that had been waiting decades to happen. I watched Margaret carefully. For the first time all day, I no longer saw confidence. I saw vulnerability, fear, regret. Daniel took a slow breath. Why would you do this? His voice cracked slightly. That question seemed to hit Margaret harder than anything else. She looked at her son and suddenly appeared much older than she had that morning. Because I am afraid, she whispered. The answer stunned everyone. Daniel blinked. Afraid of what? Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. Eleanor gently stepped forward. Tell him. Margaret wiped her eyes. The vineyard remained completely silent. Every guest seemed to understand that whatever came next mattered far more than the ceremony schedule. Finally, Margaret spoke. I was 26 when my first engagement ended. Nobody had expected that answer. Daniel frowned. What? She nodded slowly. Before I met your father. Her voice trembled. I was engaged to someone I thought I would spend my life with. The audience listened carefully. 3 months before the wedding, everything fell apart. She paused. I ignored warning signs because I was in love. For the first time all afternoon, nobody looked angry. Only curious. Margaret continued. After that happened, I spent years convincing myself that love makes people blind. Her eyes moved toward Daniel. And when I saw you getting married. She stopped speaking. Daniel's face softened slightly. You thought I was making the same mistake. Margaret nodded. Tears continued falling. I know how that sounds. Eleanor folded her arms. The problem is not fear, Margaret. The problem is believing your fear should control everyone else's life. Those words struck with painful accuracy. Margaret lowered her head. I looked around at the guests. The tension had changed. Earlier they witnessed humiliation. Now they were witnessing something else entirely. A family secret unraveling in real time. Yet despite finally hearing explanations, one question still remained unanswered. I stepped forward and spoke for the first time in several minutes. If you were so worried about Daniel, I asked quietly, why did you wait until today? Margaret looked directly at me. The sadness in her eyes deepened instantly. Because this was never really about Daniel. My breath caught. The entire audience seemed to lean forward at once. And in that moment, I realized the truth behind everything that had happened was still waiting to be revealed. The entire vineyard remained silent after Margaret's words. Because this was never really about Daniel. The statement echoed through the ceremony space, leaving everyone searching for an explanation. Even Eleanor looked surprised. Daniel stood motionless beside me. The guests who had arrived expecting a wedding now found themselves witnessing a family story none of them knew existed. Margaret wiped her eyes and took a slow breath. For several moments, she seemed unable to continue. Then she looked directly at me. This was about me. The answer confused everyone, including me. What does that mean? I asked quietly. Margaret lowered her gaze. After my engagement ended all those years ago, I built my entire life around avoiding that kind of pain again. Her voice trembled. When I married Daniel's father, I promised myself I would never ignore warning signs. Never trust blindly. Never let emotions make decisions for me. She paused. At first that mindset helped me. Then it became something else. Eleanor nodded sadly, as though she had seen this pattern for decades. Margaret continued. I started believing that every major decision needed to be examined from every possible angle. She looked toward Daniel. When you were a child, I worried constantly. Her eyes moved back to me. When you started dating Emily, I worried. Daniel shook his head slowly. Mom. But she kept talking. It felt like years of unspoken truth were finally breaking free. Every milestone brought new fears. Every change felt like a potential disaster waiting to happen. The audience listened quietly. Nobody looked angry anymore. Most people simply looked sad. Then Margaret said something that changed the entire situation. 3 years ago, my doctor diagnosed me with severe anxiety. I heard gasps from several relatives. Daniel stared at his mother in disbelief. You never told me that. Margaret nodded. I know. Her voice became smaller. I was embarrassed. The revelation suddenly connected dozens of loose pieces. The constant worrying. The need to control details. The endless concerns about things that had not happened. It was not manipulation. It was fear that had gradually taken over her life. Margaret continued. I attended counseling for a while. She smiled weakly. Some days I did well. Other days I convinced myself I could manage alone. Eleanor quietly looked away. It was obvious she already knew this part of the story. When Daniel proposed to Emily, Margaret said, I was genuinely happy. Her eyes filled with tears again. I want everyone to understand that. She looked directly at me. I never disliked you. The word surprised me. After everything that had happened, I realized I had never actually questioned whether she liked me. The problem had always felt bigger than that. Margaret took another breath. But as the wedding approached, my anxiety got worse. She glanced toward the guests. Every decision became something I needed to analyze. Her eyes lowered. Every small concern became a major concern in my mind. Suddenly, the strange messages made sense. The seating chart, the ceremony changes, the conversations with vendors. She had not been trying to take over the wedding because she wanted attention. She had been trying to calm fears nobody else could see. Then why stand up during the ceremony? Daniel asked softly. That question seemed to hurt her most of all. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Because I panicked. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The honesty was devastating in its simplicity. I sat there watching the ceremony begin and suddenly became convinced that if I did not say something immediately, I would regret it forever. Tears rolled down her cheeks. By the time I stood up, I honestly believed I was helping. The admission felt painfully human. Wrong. Deeply wrong. But human. Daniel stared at his mother for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. His anger began to fade. Not disappear, but soften. He finally understood what had driven her actions. Understanding did not erase the damage. Yet it changed the way the damage looked. I looked around at the guests. Many appeared emotional now. The atmosphere had transformed completely. What began as public humiliation had become a public confession. Then Margaret turned toward me. Her expression carried more regret than I had ever seen in another person. Emily, she said quietly, I owe you an apology that I can never fully repay. My heart tightened. The entire vineyard waited. The officiant, the guests, Daniel, everyone. Margaret took one final shaky breath. But there is one more thing you deserve to know before you decide whether this wedding should continue. The words instantly changed the atmosphere again, because the way she said them made it clear that another secret still remained. And whatever it was, she had been carrying it long before this wedding day ever began. The vineyard felt impossibly quiet as Margaret stood in front of nearly 200 guests holding everyone's attention. I could hear the wind moving through the trees. I could hear distant birds somewhere beyond the ceremony area. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. We were all waiting for whatever secret she believed needed to be revealed before the wedding could continue. Margaret looked directly at me. Her eyes were red from crying. The confidence she had carried all morning was completely gone. What remained was a woman who looked exhausted. 3 months after Daniel proposed, she said softly, I found something. My stomach tightened immediately. Daniel looked confused. Found what? Margaret swallowed hard. A letter. The word seemed almost insignificant after everything else that had happened. Yet the expression on her face suggested otherwise. What letter? Daniel asked. Margaret looked embarrassed. deeply embarrassed. One that was never meant for me. The realization hit me first. My eyes widened. You opened something that belonged to someone else. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes. Suddenly I knew exactly where this was going. The missing letter. The broken seal. Daniel stared at his mother in disbelief. You opened my letter to Emily? Margaret lowered her head. I did. Audible gasps spread through the audience again. Daniel looked stunned. I felt a strange mix of anger and validation. For hours I had questioned my instincts. Now I finally had confirmation. Margaret continued speaking before anyone could interrupt. I saw the envelope while helping organize wedding materials. Her voice trembled. At first I only intended to move it somewhere safe. She paused. Then I started wondering what you wrote. The shame in her expression was impossible to miss. And once the thought entered my mind, I could not stop thinking about it. Daniel looked heartbroken. Not furious. Heartbroken. Mom. The single word carried years of disappointment. Margaret wiped her eyes again. I know. She took a slow breath. What I did was wrong. Nobody argued with that. She continued. When I opened the letter, I expected to find certainty. I frowned. Certainty. Margaret nodded. Something that would prove you were making the right decision. The logic made no sense. Yet I was beginning to understand that fear rarely follows logic. Instead, she said quietly, I found something else. Daniel stared at her. What? Margaret looked toward her son. Tears rolled down her face. I found a man who loved his future wife completely. Silence settled over the vineyard. Margaret smiled sadly. Every page talked about partnership, trust, respect. Her voice broke. You wrote about how Emily challenged you to become a better person. Daniel looked away. The audience remained completely still. The more I read, Margaret continued, the more obvious it became that my fears had nothing to do with reality. I felt my emotions shifting in directions I never expected. Anger remained, but it was no longer standing alone. Compassion had started appearing beside it. Margaret continued, I resealed the envelope because I was ashamed. She looked directly at me. Then I convinced myself I could pretend it never happened. The honesty hurt, yet it also explained everything. But if you knew that, I asked, why keep interfering? Margaret laughed sadly. Because admitting I was wrong meant admitting I needed help. The answer felt painfully real. Eleanor slowly nodded from her seat. Daniel finally spoke again. Why did you never tell me about the diagnosis? Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Because mothers spend their lives trying to appear strong. Her voice softened. Sometimes we forget our children become adults. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. For the first time all afternoon, neither looked angry. They simply looked tired. Tired of carrying years of unspoken fears and expectations. Then something happened that nobody expected. Daniel stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his mother. The audience collectively exhaled. Margaret immediately broke down crying. Not dramatically, quietly, like someone finally releasing a burden she had carried for far too long. I stood there watching them. My wedding dress swayed lightly in the afternoon breeze. The ceremony schedule had been destroyed. The reception timeline was ruined. Guests would probably talk about this day for years. Yet something important had happened. The truth was finally standing in the open where nobody could hide from it. After several moments, Daniel stepped back and looked toward me. His expression was uncertain, vulnerable. Emily, he said softly. I knew exactly what he was asking without him saying it. The entire vineyard seemed to turn toward me at once. Guests, family members, friends, even the officiant. They were all waiting for the same answer. The wedding could still continue, or it could end right there. And for the first time all day, the next decision belonged entirely to me. For several seconds, I could not speak. Nearly 200 people sat waiting for my answer. The vineyard that had once felt joyful now felt suspended in time. Daniel stood a few feet away. His eyes were fixed on me. Margaret remained beside him, emotionally exhausted after finally admitting the truth. The officiant held his notes without moving. Even the photographers seemed unsure whether they should continue documenting the moment. I looked around at the faces in the crowd. My parents, friends, relatives, people who cared about us. Earlier that day, I would have given anything to avoid this kind of public scene. Now I realized something unexpected. The embarrassment was no longer the most important thing. The truth was, I took a slow breath and stepped forward. I am angry, I said honestly. My voice carried across the vineyard. Nobody looked surprised. I am hurt. I glanced toward Margaret. and I will probably be processing today for a very long time. Margaret nodded silently. Tears continued rolling down her cheeks. Then I looked at Daniel. But none of that changes why I am standing here. His eyes immediately filled with emotion. The tension across the audience began to soften. I continued speaking. I came here because I love this man. My voice trembled slightly. And because I believe a marriage should be built on honesty. I paused. Well, today has certainly given us honesty. A few guests laughed nervously. The reaction broke some of the tension. Even I managed a small smile. Then I turned fully toward Margaret. There was something I needed to say before anything else could happen. You owe me an apology. The words were calm, but firm. Margaret nodded immediately. I know. I took another breath. Opening that letter was wrong. Changing parts of the wedding was wrong. Standing up during the ceremony was wrong. More tears appeared in Margaret's eyes. You are right. For the first time all day, she did not try to justify her actions. She simply accepted responsibility. That mattered more than I expected. And if we are going to be family, I continued, there have to be boundaries. Margaret nodded again. There will be. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I promise. I studied her carefully. Earlier that morning, I would not have believed anything she said. Now I saw something different. Not a woman trying to control everyone around her. A woman finally acknowledging how much fear had been controlling her. The distinction mattered. Daniel stepped closer. Emily, he said softly. I turned toward him. I should have paid attention sooner. I knew exactly what he meant. The warning signs. The private conversations. The tendency to dismiss concerns because dealing with them felt uncomfortable. He was not responsible for his mother's choices. But he did have a responsibility to address problems before they grew larger. I know, I said. He nodded. And I am sorry. Looking at him standing there beneath the floral arch, I remembered every reason I had agreed to marry him in the first place. Not because he was perfect, because he was willing to grow, willing to listen, willing to admit mistakes. Those qualities mattered far more than a flawless wedding day. Finally, I turned toward the officiant. The poor man still looked completely overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Do we still have a ceremony? I asked. The question triggered laughter throughout the audience. Genuine laughter this time. The kind that arrives after tension finally begins to release. The officiant smiled. If you would still like one, I believe we can continue. I looked at Daniel. He looked at me. Neither of us needed words. We both knew the answer. The guests erupted into applause as we returned to our places. Margaret quietly stepped back into the front row beside Eleanor. The sisters exchanged a look filled with decades of history. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Then something remarkable happened. The ceremony resumed. Not as the perfect event we originally planned. Something better. Something real. The vows felt more meaningful because they came after difficulty rather than before it. Every promise carried greater weight. Every word felt earned. When Daniel promised honesty, I believed him. When I promised commitment, I understood exactly what commitment required. Life would not always be easy. Families would not always be simple. But we would face those challenges together. As the ceremony moved forward beneath the warm Tennessee sky, I glanced briefly toward Margaret. She was crying again. Yet for the first time all day, there was no fear in her expression. Only relief. And as we prepared to exchange our rings, I realized the story of this day was no longer about what had been ruined. It was about what had finally begun to heal. 1 year later, I stood in the same vineyard where everything had nearly fallen apart. The late afternoon sun painted the hills gold, and a gentle breeze moved through the rows of grapevines exactly as it had on the day Daniel and I were married. This time, however, there were no photographers rushing around, no ceremony schedules, no anxious guests waiting for events to begin. Just family, real family, the kind that exists after difficult conversations have been faced instead of avoided. Daniel stood beside me holding 2 cups of coffee from a small cafe near the entrance. He handed one to me and smiled. Hard to believe it has been a year. I laughed softly. Some parts feel like yesterday. Other parts feel like another lifetime. He nodded. We both knew exactly what I meant. The first few months after the wedding had not been easy. Healing rarely follows a straight line. There were uncomfortable discussions, boundaries that needed to be established, expectations that needed to be clarified. More importantly, there were choices that had to be made consistently rather than spoken once and forgotten. To her credit, Margaret followed through on every promise she made that day. She returned to counseling. She became honest about her anxiety instead of hiding it. She stopped trying to manage situations that were not hers to manage. Most importantly, she learned to ask questions instead of making decisions for other people. None of those changes happened overnight. They required effort, patience, humility. There were moments when old habits resurfaced. Moments when Daniel and I had to gently remind her of the boundaries we had agreed upon. But each time, she listened. Each time, she corrected herself. That mattered. Growth is not perfection. Growth is willingness. As Daniel and I walked toward the outdoor patio, I spotted Margaret sitting at a table beneath a large umbrella. Eleanor sat beside her. The two sisters appeared relaxed in a way I had never seen before. Whatever tensions had existed between them seemed lighter now. Not erased, simply acknowledged. Margaret noticed us approaching and smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that reached her eyes. "Happy anniversary," she said. There was warmth in her voice instead of nervousness. I smiled back. "Thank you." A year earlier, I never would have imagined such a simple exchange feeling meaningful. Yet it did. Because trust is built from small moments repeated over time. We spent the next hour talking, laughing, and sharing stories. No one mentioned the ceremony at first. It no longer dominated every conversation the way it once had. Life had continued. New memories had formed. New traditions had begun. Eventually, however, Eleanor raised her coffee cup and smiled. "Well," she said, "this anniversary has gone considerably smoother than the wedding." Everyone laughed, including Margaret. Especially Margaret. She shook her head. That is probably the understatement of the century. Even now, there was embarrassment in her voice when discussing that day. Yet there was also accountability. She never tried to rewrite what happened. She never minimized it. She accepted it as part of her story. And because of that, everyone else could move forward too. A few minutes later, Margaret looked toward me. Her expression became thoughtful. "Can I tell you something?" I nodded. She smiled softly. "For years, I thought protecting people meant preventing mistakes." She glanced at Daniel, then back at me. "Now I think protecting people sometimes means trusting them enough to make their own choices." The statement stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was earned. Lessons only matter when they come from experience. The sun slowly began setting behind the hills. Golden lights stretched across the vineyard. Guests from nearby events laughed in the distance. The atmosphere felt peaceful. As I sat there surrounded by family, I found myself thinking about the younger version of me who stood in a bridal suite 1 year earlier staring at a strange text message and wondering why everything felt wrong. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her something simple. The wedding was never ruined. The plan was ruined. The schedule was ruined. The illusion of perfection was ruined. But the marriage survived. The family survived. In some ways, they became stronger because the truth was forced into the open. Life rarely follows the script we write for it. Relationships certainly do not. People bring their fears, scars, and mistakes into every chapter of life. The goal is not finding people without flaws. The goal is finding people willing to face those flaws honestly. As the evening light faded and our family gathered for one final photograph together, I looked at Daniel, then at Margaret, then at the people surrounding us. A year earlier, I thought the most important part of a wedding was having the perfect day. Now I understood something much more valuable. The most important part is what happens after the day ends. And for the first time since that unforgettable afternoon, every person in our family seemed ready for the future.